So it's really an honor and pleasure to invite colleagues from Oxford University. Unfortunately, Phil Howard could not be with us today, but his colleagues are here, and Aliaksandr Herasimenka is going to actually take the lead in introducing his colleagues and getting the panel started, and I will join you in the Q&A portion.
Thank you. Hi everyone again. Yes, my name is Aliaksandr Herasimenka. I am Director of Research at Program on Democracy and Technology at Oxford Internet Institute. I just quickly go through the sets of papers, research that we'll be doing right now. It's research in progress, and I will just introduce basically our titles for today's short presentation. We focus on the state of, in fact, global state of information environment, and here we're trying to map out the current trends and possible future developments. And we start with a presentation of results of an expert survey, global expert survey that covers many countries. I try to understand what's happening across information environment and possible misinformation campaigns that might happen according to experts, and then that's going to be presented by our colleague Hubert. Next, we will turn to Hannah Bailey, who will discuss large-scale data sets and what they can tell us about the state of information environment on digital platforms. And finally, I will discuss systematic review of misinformation literature published over the last 12 or so years. Just a few words about our program. It's part of Internet Institute, and we're focusing on civic engagement and trying to solve public problems through social data science. We're quite a big team of researchers, quite diverse, coming from different places across the world. And what we're especially proud is that our program of research is also focusing on many different contexts, national contexts. Basically, we try to cover all major contexts across the world. And just this research has been supported by a variety of foundations listed here. Just interestingly, wanted to refer to previous earlier results of our work that have been reflected in a report called Cyber Troops that have been published over the last 3 years, covering what's happening in terms of information manipulation online across different contexts. And we've seen constant increase and constant growth in number of information campaigns that try to manipulate public opinion, that often come or sponsored by national governments, but also by private or independent groups and enterprises. All right, so with that, I would like to turn to Hubert, who's, by the way, a doctoral candidate at Oxford Internet Institute. We're going to talk about global misinformation expert survey.
Thanks, Alas. Is there a, can I just take this and All right, thank you so much, Alex. And very excited to be here today. Thank you for having us. And I'd like to share with you today some kind of ongoing results that we have on an expert survey that we're running kind of live at the moment. But just before that, kind of listening to everything that's been said today, maybe there are two things I kind of would love to get out of this. One, kind of any critical feedback that you might have. But second, necessarily, I think with the kind of global focus or multi-country focus, we're going to have to kind of take what we've talked today and kind of explode it into more context than we've been discussing. So particularly with the Global South that we've been mentioning, but thinking about more languages than English, more media kind of spheres than the US, and I think that's really important when it comes to misinformation, certainly, and I hope to highlight some of that, but also would like to kind of pose the question of how, if at all, does any of this inform or kind of change your thinking that's been so excellent on all of this. So with that, and I also apologize for all the bar charts you're going to see. It's a bit of work in progress. I promise to publish what I think have this many bar charts. So what are we trying to do with the survey? Well, we want to both to canvass the kind of current state of misinformation as experts see it around the world, but maybe also to generate some kind of index that maybe we can repeat over a number of years. And so this is the first time we're running it, and there are going to be a lot of learnings as we go along the way. But how do the world's experts perceive the varied risks of misinformation? What are we considering to be experts? And how is our sampling done? So this is updated as of this morning, so it's all very much live. So we started off with, as Alice will talk about later, a kind of systematic review of misinformation and anybody who's published an academic article on it in the last 12 years. And from that, we went out and tried to get a bunch of email addresses, and from there we have kind of an academic base to start with, and now as we're building it more and more, we're branching out to individuals who have more media professional expertise, who work in civil society organizations, fact-checking organizations. So we really want to try and build a kind of broad picture of what's going on with a range of expertise. So just to run through some of the numbers, currently we've sent out a little less than 400 invitations. We've had a response rate, quite encouragingly, about a third. We have 56 unique countries covered, obviously some more than others, and I haven't broken it down here just to kind of keep the table small, but we have at least 7 responses from every region around the world, so kind of sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, Northern America, the kind of UN designation of regions. And we really, as I mentioned, kind of want this to be global in its scope, and so roughly half of our respondents have responded for a country in the Global South, which we think is quite encouraging. About 40% of our researchers or respondents have self-identified as women. And as a measure of kind of expertise, 86% of our respondents have at least have a doctoral degree or at least 5 years of professional experience. And we allow respondents to respond from multiple countries. So most people have answered for 1, but a couple have answered for 2, and some a couple more. So that's the kind of sampling and method for our data. And we've asked a number of things. We want to ask about the kind of platforms that concern them in their country of expertise, any particularly salient or problematic topics of misinformation, which may be different from the more common topics of misinformation, who's generating this misinformation, who are the targets of this misinformation, and we leave the kind of precise definition of misinformation up to the experts. So we don't want to pigeonhole them into a particular type, but we do give them scope to give examples of particular cases of misinformation that stand out to them, and we will be able to go through them once we have all the data in. And we want to get a sense of, well, what are the kind of countermeasures that they envision, what do they foresee the state of misinformation in that country to be like in the future. So to get into some of the data, this is aggregated across all of our respondents, and on the x-axis you have the percentage of experts who indicated a particular platform is of concern in that country. And unsurprisingly, Facebook kind of floats to the top, but maybe interestingly, TikTok and Instagram are relatively low. Just below half of experts indicate TikTok, and even less for Instagram, and maybe that says something about the academic community. And we'll see later that whilst they do identify that video is particularly, or one of the major problem sources of misinformation, TikTok and Instagram, which are pretty major distribution platforms for that, are relatively low. And this might also be because TikTok and Instagram are quite difficult to get data from, quite notoriously in TikTok's case. And maybe that academics are a little bit more reluctant to indicate that for something they haven't published or have some kind of solid backing. Then, what kind of topics are problematic? And again, you might expect kind of local national politics, close to the top, but coronavirus and international politics are the next two. And I think this also highlights something that I mentioned earlier of how this this kind of international focus changed the thinking that we've heard before. We've used this word polity before, and in the context of the responsibilities of media institutions and how they relate to polity, does this at all? And maybe this is some question to ask, but I defer to your expertise. Should the polity be considered just the United States, for example, or just Germany, or just a country, whereas the influence of the media institutions will stretch more than that polity, that boundary we're drawing. Right? So my uncle bought hydroxychloroquine, presumably because of some of the influence of US media institutions. All right. What kind of formats of misinformation are prevalent? And text, again, is at the top, but static images and videos are also very important. Audio recording seems to be quite low, but as we'll see, if we break it down into the kind of regions where people are answering audio recordings, oh, sorry, before that, we'll get to that. One thing we ask is we kind of allow the experts, once they've indicated what types or formats of misinformation they think are particularly problematic, they can kind of rank how severe is this problem on this type of misinformation. So we can kind of aggregate that into some sort of severity index, and you can kind of see that in this heat map here. So a little bit of break from my bar charts. Darker means more severe, and Egypt is the kind of highest one here, and you don't have any numerical values, but it goes up to out of 10, and Egypt is about a 9. So for all the things, for all the types of misinformation that experts have indicated, they think it's all very, very severe.
So wait, Ukraine is worse than Russia?
Yeah. And that might just be because of the sampling that we have, so maybe we have fewer Russian experts who have answered it than Ukrainian or, yeah. So going back to audio recordings, you can kind of break it down, and you can see that in Latin America and a lot from Brazil, this is particularly of concern, and this is kind of quite resonant with an earlier piece of data on platforms where WhatsApp is 92% of our experts think is a big problem of concern in Brazil. And I think maybe when we think of WhatsApp, we also think typically of India, but this indicates certainly Brazilian experts are very concerned as well, and specifically audio recordings on WhatsApp. And we can do this similarly with video. So Eastern Europe is particularly concerned about video. We do give the option to experts to specify what kinds of videos. Some people said not deepfakes, some said specifically we're very concerned about deepfakes. That is kind of detail that will have to come in the full report. But this is somehow strangely dissonant with, again, TikTok, where we might expect is a major platform of how you disseminate video-based disinformation. But Eastern Europe is not so high on this graph. And it's not exactly clear why, and it may be because of some of the reasons I mentioned before about particular sampling. This is a bit of a curiosity. All right, so then sources of misinformation, and we can see independent producers, and this is independent citizens or influencers, and this is the highest, or most experts think this is the kind of, most experts indicated this over others. And this is maybe a little bit resonant to what Deus mentioned at the beginning of the day, that anybody can kind of get up and repeat something many, many times in the news. Something that might strike you as curious is that government agencies and foreign governments appear quite low. And this might also seem to be dissonant with one of the earlier observations that Alice mentioned from our previous work, that there's kind of an increasing amount of government-led information operations or sources of misinformation. But I think this is not actually in conflict for two reasons, and one of them is the sample size at the moment. We have about 50 countries, and if we extrapolate to the number of countries we had in those studies, so over 150, then you would get to the similar numbers, even worse actually. But also because when you break it down by region, again, as you might expect, Eastern Europe kind of floats to the top of foreign government interference in the media ecosystem. And then, of course, in the average stack, it appears to be a bit lower overall globally. Then, similarly, for domestic kind of interference with government agencies, we can see Northern Africa floats to the top, which is also resonant with maybe our existing expectations in the MENA region. And we'll hear a little bit more about domestic interference with my colleague Hannah. Then I just want to round off with what our experts thought about the state of misinformation to come in the coming year or so. And this was like a Likert scale that I've just converted into numbers, so -2 being very confident that the situation will worsen, and 2 being very confident that it will improve. And so we can see that all over the globe, in very geographically distant regions, experts are very concerned that it's going to worsen in whatever way they interpreted that. And it just only in Western Europe and curiously in Western Asia, there's a little bit of confidence that it will improve. And maybe this is to do with some of the European Union work that was mentioned earlier today. But that is all to bring me to the conclusion that this is an urgent problem, as we know. And so hopefully lends urgency to some of the questions that I was asking you about. How do we think of everything we've talked about today in an international context? How do we situate our conceptions of misinformation and how it relates to democracy in a global setting where we have to have interface between democracies and not democracies? I guess that was kind of my vague last point. It was kind of my way to segue into that. So that brings me to the end of our current results on our survey, and look forward to kind of publishing it in due time. And I'll hand over to my colleague Hannah.
Hi, thank you again for having us to speak here today. It's an honor to be here. And I'm sorry again that Phil and also Lisa Maria, who was hoping to be here, couldn't make it today. I know they're disappointed to not be able to be here. But I will be talking today about the sources and targets of misinformation and how we can use large data sets to identify both the sources and the targets. My broader PhD work looks at social data science tools and how we can use these tools to detect particular misleading frames, particularly in Chinese propaganda. But today I'll be taking a global look at the misinformation environment. So, we've talked a lot today about how social media has increased the availability of information, but also the ability to manipulate this information has become, it's become a lot easier to do so. And various actors are motivated to manipulate this information for various different reasons, but the most common that we have seen, at least in our previous reports, has been domestic politics issues, election campaigns, around elections, one candidate will want to defame another candidate, and these are the kind of issues that we see lead to large-scale misinformation campaigns at a domestic level. But then on an international level, we often see various states use misinformation campaigns to achieve their various diplomatic aims in other regions of the world. So we want to quantify the scale of misinformation on a global level, but this is quite difficult because, of course, these misinformation campaigns are designed to be hidden. So how do you measure them? How do you detect them? And how can you be confident that you've detected a representative sample of these misinformation campaigns? Well, the answer is it's very difficult. I'm not proposing that what I've done here is by any means measuring everything that's out there, but we have relied on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, some of the biggest social media platforms, and the information that they provided and made public on the accounts that they've suspended for conducting misinformation campaigns. And relying on the data from the social media companies has pros and cons. The pros being it's obviously detected using data from their platforms. They have access to large amounts of metadata that we as researchers do not have access to, standing outside of these platforms. So they have a lot more information available to them that can say, yes, we can be confident that this is a misinformation campaign. But then the con to that is obviously the other side of the coin. It's very opaque because it's done by the social media companies, right? We don't know what metrics they've used to say that this is a misinformation campaign, and we are unclear where the line is that they've drawn between a misinformation campaign and legitimate activity. But this is the best we can do it for now. But we obviously, as researchers, would love to see more transparency and more data be made available from these social media companies for us to work with. So we have used, like I said, so Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, Facebook and Instagram being Meta, obviously, in recent years have, since 2017/18, have begun publishing the data from the accounts that they've taken down from their platforms for conducting misinformation campaigns. And Twitter and Meta publish slightly different versions of this data, but what we've done is take this data all together and compiled it into one large, unique event data set. So we can hopefully get a sense for misinformation on a global scale, which actors and which countries in particular are responsible for these campaigns, and which countries and regions of the world are being targeted by these campaigns. So this is just a brief slide on the descriptive, just some descriptive statistics from this data set that we've compiled. So in total, we have 89,000, just over 89,000 accounts that Twitter's taken down since 2017 for conducting misinformation. And these accounts were responsible over actually a 14-year period, because it's important to bear in mind that these accounts were active before 2017. They were actually just taken down then, between 2017 and 2021. So during about a 14-year period, give or take, depending on the extent to which that account was active during that period, these 89,000 accounts were responsible for 257 million tweets on the platform. And then these tweets received over 754 million engagements. And I'm sure you know, as engagements we mean a like on the tweet, a retweet. It's engagement by other users who you presume are genuine social media users with this misinformation. So we have a very large number of tweets put out by these accounts, and also a very large amount of engagement with these misinformation tweets before they were taken down by the platforms. And then these accounts used 74 different languages in the tweets. That's a large number of languages. So yeah, we have a large number of tweets, large amount of engagement, posting in a large number of languages. Now from Meta, as I said, the data is slightly different, but we, over a period between 2018 actually for Meta and 2021, they took down over 65,000 accounts for conducting misinformation campaigns, and these accounts targeted 68 countries, different countries with these campaigns, and the accounts were instigated from 79 different countries. So a very global picture that we've got going on here. So this is from the data from Twitter, because Twitter, as I said, the data that is provided by Twitter and Meta is slightly different. So Twitter allows us to take a more granular look at the tweets that were posted by these accounts before they were suspended. And I've just mapped out on the x-axis, we've got these tweets over time. Here on this axis in blue, this is the blue line, this is the blue line. We've got the engagement per tweet, so the amount of engagement that each tweet received. And on the red line, we have the number of tweets in millions. And you can see this red line goes up and then it goes right down at the end. That's because obviously these accounts were taken down at some point between 2017 and 2021. So of course it's going to decrease as the accounts are taken down. But overall, these accounts were very active, as we saw in the previous slide, tweeting a large number of tweets. But if we look at the average engagement, it's actually really low. averaging between 0 and 1 before we get to 2020. But then right in 2020, we have Twitter was very active about taking down a lot of accounts at the beginning of 2020, coinciding with the pandemic, so you can kind of infer what happened there. But the accounts that remained after this mass takedown actually received a lot more engagement. So interesting, we have a story of Twitter taking down a lot of accounts at the start of the pandemic, but the accounts that they missed until later on actually received a lot more engagement. So yeah, interesting story here. Now, if we take a closer look at the languages that we use by these accounts, like I said earlier, 74 languages in total we see across this whole data set. But interestingly, this plot looks at the 5 most prevalent languages over all of the tweets that were put out. We look at the 5 languages that were most prevalent. And right at the top, we see Arabic and Turkish. Those are the 2 languages in which were most prevalent across all of these tweets suspended for misinformation. Then we have Spanish, then we have Serbian, and 5th we have English. Now this is not what I expected to find going into this. Given the prevalence of English, it's actually not the language in which not the most prevalent language in which misinformation is spread on Twitter. So that's very interesting because obviously as researchers, misinformation researchers tend to focus on English language misinformation, tend to focus their efforts and analysis on English language misinformation. But there's a lot of misinformation out there that's not in English. Maybe we're missing something by not looking at this content. So also interestingly, we have some stories going on here in spikes in different language misinformation. So you might see between mid-2018 and 2020, there's a spike in red in Serbian, and this coincides with protests going on in Serbia against the Serbian Progressive Party in power at the time. And this was likely, Twitter suspects that this was a misinformation campaign that was spreading pro-party propaganda and trying to defame the protesters. So interesting kind of country-level stories that we see going on there. Right. Now, switching tracks a little bit, so I said that here we're trying to look at the sources and the targets of misinformation. So on the previous slide, languages gave us kind of a sense for which regions of the world might be targeted by inferring from the languages that are targeted, but here we have a more granular look at the regions of the world that were targeted. Now, previously, so when I first looked into this data, I thought, oh right, I'll just create a heat map looking at the countries that are the most targeted by misinformation. But then I made the map, and of course, it was just the countries that tended to have the largest populations that were the most targeted. And that makes sense, countries with a large population, there's more misinformation going around, there's more misinformation targeted towards that population. So this map is actually weighted, and it's weighted by population. So we've taken the number of misinformation accounts targeted towards a particular country, weighted by that country's population. So what you get is a look at where misinformation is disproportionately targeted. So which populations are disproportionately targeted by misinformation relative to their population size. And interestingly, this is a heat map. The darker the country, the more disproportionately targeted it is. So interestingly, I've listed here the countries with the highest ratios. 4 of these countries are former Soviet republics, amongst which you have Ukraine. So clearly a heavy, disproportionate targeting of these particular countries by misinformation campaigns. Yes, and so if we look at the other side of that coin, these are the countries that are responsible for misinformation. And again, this is a ratio, so it's a weighting of misinformation campaigns initiated by these countries, weighted by their population size. So here we have a sense for which countries are disproportionately responsible for conducting misinformation campaigns. And interestingly, if you look at the countries with the highest ratios, there are actually 4 countries on here that were in the previous slide that were both the largest disproportionate targets of misinformation and countries responsible for misinformation. We have Georgia, Nicaragua, Palestine, and Kyrgyzstan. Now, what is going on in these countries? Well, and here I think this is a point that we've made at various points throughout the day. there's a difference between domestically targeted misinformation campaigns and internationally targeted misinformation campaigns. So what we're seeing in these 4 countries are actually large-scale misinformation campaigns coming from within these countries targeted towards their own populations. Yeah, that's what we see here. And I thought this is a very interesting story, so I made another map and this is not a ratio, this is just a map with the raw numbers looking at the number of accounts. So this is looking at countries only countries that are targeting their own domestic populations, and just a raw number of which countries are the most responsible for targeting their own populations. And you can see the US, very high up there. Mexico. Now, a lot of these numbers for Mexico come from a election that happened during the period in which Meta was focused on taking down these accounts. So again, we see here a story of domestic manipulation during a campaign season. We also see Ukraine, very high, Georgia. We saw in the previous slides, former Soviet republics with a lot of domestically focused misinformation campaigns. So I'll just wrap up a little bit here. What do we see? So both in the languages, in the countries disproportionately targeted, and the countries disproportionately responsible for misinformation campaigns, we see a lot of stuff here that just isn't in English. It isn't from Western Europe. It isn't from Northern America. It's not in the areas of the world that we as academics and researchers typically look for misinformation. So I think a lot of work in the academic community needs to be kind of more focused on these areas, more outward looking, and understand the theories that we developed based on our research on Western democracies, on English language. Misinformation actually applies to these contexts. So we see specific regions, particularly, as I said, in the former Soviet republics, that are disproportionately targeted by these campaigns. And we also have an interesting difference here between domestically targeted campaigns, internationally targeted campaigns. And again, these can be 2 very different beasts. And finally, just coming back to what I said at the start about this is data from the big social media companies. And there's a lot of opaqueness about how they've identified these campaigns, what metrics they have used, where even the line is between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. Oftentimes the content that's deemed egregious enough to be taken down is very much on the extreme and very obviously misinformation. But there's a lot of other misinformation that social media companies might think, that's okay, maybe we'll leave up, we won't actually flag that. And that's not captured in this data set. So again, that's something maybe we need to think about, having some definitions of types of activities that are acceptable, types of activities that we deem egregious enough to take down. And with that, I'll pass on to Alice.
Thank you, Anna. Amazing. So this was basically, I think, a very important message here, showing how high volume of essentially campaigns that try to spread lie is not necessarily attributed to Western countries. And this was 2 amazing pieces of empirical research that currently been ongoing. To summarize our current program of research, I will just review what's been done so far previously by misinformation researchers over the last 12 or so years, because I think it's just time for us to summarize and understand in order to move forward. And here we've been looking into specifically possible consequences of information that's been classified as misinformation or disinformation or fake news or rumors, and possible policy recommendations that have been proposed by researchers who publish in peer-reviewed academic journals on that topic, and specifically focusing on empirically studying any type of what we defined as misinformation on digital platforms, so any type of essentially social media platform. We've been looking at essentially state of the literature in that area and solutions being evaluated and recommended. Interesting, yeah? So what we found? First of all, we found that quite a lot of research surprisingly been published over that period, more than 3,000 papers. And it's of course not all, but just, as I mentioned, empirical platform in English. We selected about 360 that been most cited and been published in different databases classified as top journals. And we selected a few of them, 11, for additional meta review. So it's kind of additional analysis of specific solution being offered that they're gonna go in a second. So the first observation we make is that while we observe from our current empirical review that's been presented just right now, a lot of things happening all across the world. Most of the research been done, published, and focused on a few mostly English-speaking countries. So it's US, UK, Australia, so on. China is a bit of an exception, and this is what's been growing. So quite a lot of research into misinformation, very often called or defined as rumors in that literature, being published by scholars in China, focusing on the context of China. The second thing is, interestingly, we can more or less, using topic modeling, classify majority of the papers we've been reviewing into three main baskets, three main sets, three main domains. So the first domain, which let's say could it be, for instance, these two areas, concerns population health. And this has been growing over the last 2 years, first of all because of COVID-19. So it's studies that look into population behavior in relation to perceived information or disinformation regarding COVID-19 pandemic, or for instance, vaccines that address this issue, and similar stories. So it's anti-vaccination literature, population health, quite a lot, and it's majority of literature in that domain, in fact. The second domain is this more like individual type of behavioral studies that focus on cognitive skills, cognitive abilities of people to recognize possible misinformation and act accordingly. For instance, these are studies that discuss sharing behavior. If a person sees a piece of content that might appear to be misinformation, to what extent, what influences their decision to share it or not online to their friends, to their followers, these type of studies. Quite a lot of them. And actually the smallest domain focuses on issues of democracy, on issues of politics and society apparently. Fewer than others, interestingly. So we perceive it as the biggest perhaps problem, right? But apparently most of the research published in this area comes and focuses on more medical aspects or psychological aspects. Interesting, yeah? Second, as I mentioned, I promised you two types of takes away. The second one comes, and most interesting I think, comes in terms of what are the solutions, what are the ways to address the issue of digital lies being proposed by this academic literature. First of all, I should mention that unfortunately most of the papers do not evaluate the proposed policy solutions they offer. So they do offer stuff, normally it's in conclusion, somewhere in discussion, but they don't explain where it comes from, in fact. They don't test it, they don't provide evidence. Only 20% of the studies we studied, we evaluated, try to provide any evidence to support the solution they offer. And what are the solutions? Well, this is of course based on the overall count. The most common types of solutions concern either content moderation, not big surprise, or corrective misinformation campaigns. This comes into idea of something like we should promote information campaigns on social media, for instance, supporting certain behavior in relation to COVID-19 pandemic, like wearing masks. I'm sure you've seen this type of post appearing or pieces of content appearing to posts that mention, for instance, a mask or vaccine, right? Very often, some types of additional information appears next to this type of content that mentions certain keywords. And this is one of the examples of information campaigns. Or they can be independent, it can be advertising campaigns as well. It can be campaigns that promote fact-check materials, fact-checking sort of conclusions. And final most common solution proposed concerns content labeling. Yeah, so this type of messages that often I'm sure you've seen them, like labels, tags next to posts, next to pieces of content that, for instance, contain a link to a website that previously been noticed as spreading possible misinformation. For instance, it can be a website, it can be, for instance, state-backed media like RT, for instance, that been linked across different types of platforms as government-sponsored media. I'm sure you've seen labels before, right? Yeah, I can see people saw that. So this is 3 types of solutions. We looked into all of them, but we found that in fact most interesting and more sort of at least more number of studies that can be somehow summarized statistically. So none of them, unfortunately, yeah, in social sciences it would be difficult sometimes to summarize different studies into sort of one meta review because it is they've often categorized things differently, apply different types of strategies of reporting outcomes. So we looked at all of them, and we found so far that content labeling could be interestingly investigated, and we can summarize several studies into one to see whether content labeling works or not according to them. And what we did next? So we did what is called meta-analysis of 11 studies into content labeling. And all of them demonstrated that this method, this approach to tackling misinformation works. Specifically, what they found in the sum is that content labeling likely to increase the accuracy of information perception. In other words, if a piece of content on social media has been somehow labeled, somehow marked, either as problematic or as trusted, this increases ability of users to identify, to understand, to predict whether this piece of content can be trusted, can be further shared, for instance, or it's rather must be considered as something better to like avoid and move on. Yeah. Conclusion, very simple conclusion here. We have different number of course there are many different solutions proposed. Most common are those 3 I mentioned: content labeling, content moderation, and corrective information campaigns. It seems like there is some consensus that emerges around content labeling that might work as a further policy recommendation, sort of to introduce further across platforms and focus maybe fact-checking and other types of efforts on this specific solution. Though again, there's more evidence needed, and also what is especially, I believe, needed is some sort of comparative attempts to compare different types of solutions, right? So when we try to compare different ways to address misinformation across maybe similar populations and see what really works well and best. And this is, of course, addressing the current landscape. Well, what we can do perhaps right now, already been doing, in fact. All right. Just wanted to mention a few collaborators that helped us to conclude and help us to conduct this research at Oxford, as well as I mentioned previously, we are quite a big research team. What we also do, we produce other types of research, and if you'd like to follow it more closely, feel free to refer to our newsletters. I'm sure many of you already subscribe to them. If not, just to remind, we have 3 of them. One of them concerns COVID-19 misinformation, another one published, I believe, monthly by Hannah, by the way, concerns China-based or China-linked misinformation campaigns, and finally, the most recent one, misinformation and the war in Ukraine, that's been edited by me. All right, thanks a lot for your attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, that was fascinating and a lot to digest in a short period of time. I'll start with one question and then turn it over to our audience. And I'm wondering, Hannah, if you can comment on India and Brazil, because I was struck that they didn't feature more prominently around misinformation, and I'd love your thoughts on both of those countries.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the slides, what I was looking for is countries where misinformation campaigns were disproportionately targeted. And for countries like India and Brazil, it's likely a factor of their population size. That's not to say there's not misinformation going on there, but relative to the population size, it's not above what we would expect. So that's, I mean, the con to doing something population weighted is, of course, then you might lose some of the misinformation in countries that are, population size quite large. But we also saw a country like Mexico, which has a very large population, still disproportionately to their population has a large amount of misinformation targeted towards its population. So, and like I said, that's likely related to their election that they had in recent years. So yeah, it's, I mean, again, like I said, weighted according to their population, and interesting to see that India and Brazil, weighted for their population, are not disproportionately targeted by misinformation campaigns.
Thank you. Questions? We'll start with Matt and then move our way back. Then Justin.
Yeah, this is just a really quick methodological question. I noticed on a number of the maps that Hannah and Hugh presented, some of the countries were missing, like France and Norway and stuff. I was just wondering, is that because of limitations in obtaining data or anything like that?
I can't talk about Hubert's graph, but sorry, this is going to get very technical very quickly. In the map, sorry, apologies to people who aren't more aware of this, but in the mapping, I generated these graphs in Python. There's a very popular package used to generate mapping graphs of the world in Python, and I generated these graphs, and I thought, and loads of people use them, right? I generated these graphs, and I was like, France isn't here. It took me a second to realize that. So just awareness for anyone who tries to generate a map using, I think it's Matplotlib in Python. France isn't on, and they have to manually add France. So I don't know whether Hubert also ran into that problem. There are a couple other countries that maybe you noticed. I think maybe you picked on a few of them, but yeah, just a technical glitch there. I think I had France in my graph. Maybe Hubert, you didn't.
Yeah, pretty much the same reason. We definitely had some responses from French experts. We had a particular translation in French for that reason, just other countries that speak French. So yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, if you're a French expert or any other expert, if you feel yourself an expert in misinformation, write to Hubert, and he will supply you with the link. And the survey is still open, so it's a great opportunity to contribute to this very important output that will be published later and hopefully set the stage in some way for next year for the research agendas. So very welcome to write to Hubert.
Several questions. Larissa, I think I had said Justin, and then we'll work our way back. Yes.
So thank you all. This is supremely interesting data, and there's so much to talk about. I guess I had two questions. One of them is, I think most directly related to Hannah's presentation. And I guess it's, how does Meta and Twitter's moderation practices vary from country to country? Because one explanation for this variation is that the moderators that are working with certain countries are much more likely to take down posts in some places rather than others. And the second question, which is also related to the maps for Hubert and Hannah showed, and it's just an invitation for you to speculate on why it seems like the density of misinformation is quite different than the expert responses. We might think that the experts are going to be most concerned about misinformation in places where it's really prominent. And instead, it seems like it's a little bit different. Egypt doesn't seem uniquely or according to Hannah's map, it doesn't seem uniquely freighted with misinformation, but it seems like the experts there are very concerned with it. So I guess it's just an invitation for you to, spill some thoughts about that.
Yeah, so two main comments on that. First is that not all misinformation is created equal. Some misinformation is more harmful than others. And in some countries you might naturally expect that the misinformation is more harmful than in other countries. So that might be one explanation for the difference between the concerns raised in the expert survey compared to the misinformation detected by the platforms themselves. And the second one is related to the actual, like I said in my slides, it's so hard to measure this stuff and be confident that, yeah, we've detected all the, you can't say we've detected all the misinformation that's out there. What we try to do is use the data provided by the social media companies to get some kind of approximation on a global scale for all the misinformation that's out there. But you have to admit that in some countries, the social media companies are just going to be paying less attention to this kind of stuff, and it's going to be flagged less often. Before we changed our the way in which we do our we used to have Cyber Troops, this annual report each year where we tried to measure the in 81 countries the amount of misinformation using kind of case studies comprised on each country. And a criticism we often received is, I'm from this country, I see there's more misinformation than you've accounted for in your country case study. Why haven't you accounted for that? And oftentimes we have to say, look, we recognize that the amount of misinformation is likely underestimated in these country case studies. And again, it's likely underestimated in the amount reported by the social media companies themselves, particularly in countries where you might kind of expect that they're paying less attention, like the countries outside of Western Europe and North America.
Yeah, I can echoing what Hannah was saying. I think a good amount of the variation you see between the maps is exactly with the source of the data. But also, I think with Egypt specifically, and I only know kind of anecdotally from colleagues, they have more infrastructure, or at least more actively kind of cracking down on academics who do study this information, are more ready to arrest them at their homes, at the airport, and at the universities, and that might contribute to a greater sense of anxiety. Then on the point of content moderation, it varies massively. Basically, as I think is well documented, Facebook and a lot of these companies won't do anything unless pushed, and that basically means a lot around election cycles in particular countries, a lot in the US, but really very sparse, especially in the MENA region, and famously in Myanmar. Really very very bad coverage, and also not even consistent in the things that they claim to provide. For example, the ad library that they once had, I guess it's not, but where supposedly political ads are archived for years, I think years. And I think that might be true in the US and UK, but this has been documented to have ads in the library in Tunisia, I know specifically, after an election, and then mysteriously disappears kind of a week or so afterwards. So, the kind of, it's very, very uneven and further contributes to this dispossessedness.
Hello, Zana Wagner, from mid-career student here in HKS. I have two questions, one with respect to methodology and the other with respect to content. And the first question with respect to methodology, why did you choose use the word definition, the word misinformation term and not disinformation term? And how can actually some research made if you don't have a common understanding of definition? That's on the methodology part. The other question is like, I'm wondering if your data and your research also came up with something like how much academic institutions and researchers are part of misinformation. Thank you.
Maybe you can take the second one, I'll try and address the first one. So this was actually a problem that we ran into even making these slides, because I initially used the word information operations, which is the term used by social media companies to detect this kind of stuff. But then, of course, everyone else used the term misinformation, so I then, changed the word to misinformation. But I think you raise a point that's a problem throughout the entire field at the moment. We don't have a common lexicon to describe a lot of this kind of stuff. And I would also argue, agree with you that misinformation isn't necessarily the best umbrella term to use to cover a lot of activities that we're actually talking about here. And when I say that, I mean things that aren't necessarily untrue, but are manipulative, and that the social media companies might still flag as being problematic content. We're talking about stuff like strategic framing of content, strategic presentation. I mean, my area of expertise is China, and of course we see a lot of China taking information that is factually true, but then presenting it in a way to domestic and international audiences that is manipulative and trying to make them believe a certain thing based on the content that they present in the manner that they present it. And I would argue, even though this isn't misinformation, it still should fall under the umbrella term of problematic manipulation of content that we're trying to capture here. So I don't have a solution to the problem of this lexicon, but I mean, I know in the last at least 5 years we obviously have misinformation, disinformation, you have computational propaganda was once a very popular one, you have information operations that now the social media companies particularly like, and that seems to be the term that they're using. So I think we need to have a step back and maybe coalesce around a shared lexicon that we can be united behind in defining these things.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you again. Great point. Echoing Hannah a little bit. So specifically on the survey, I can speak to that. We use this umbrella term, right, misinformation. We do specify to the experts answering. You may understand it, prefer to use different term. Some scholars refer to more to rumors, for example. So we do state that, and we want to allow for that kind of room, and we do try to encourage as many text kind of entries as we can to allow experts to further develop their answers. And I think once we have everything in view, and if we can see in the data, like for example, that really this other term or this other way of approaching it is more fruitful, then we'd absolutely want to at least consider it, adopt it. So yeah, we do have that caveat in mind.
Yeah, I think I just agree with what you guys say. I don't really have much to add. I think. Yeah, but I think it's just basically what's happening is we're also a bit approximating when we combine in different categories and definitions into one sort of more meta one. What else we shall do? We shall somehow try to understand and summarize whether one or another approach works or not, or one or another trend happening or not, and perhaps we have no way out of it while this field is of course not unified. But I think actually when we have this polyphony of definitions and ideas and approaches, sometimes it's not that bad. In fact, it helps to address contextual issues. It helps us to look into maybe aspects of the problem, right? So disinformation often defined as something that is intentional misleading, while misinformation is often looked into something maybe not very intentional, but still misinforming. Maybe it's one of the crucial definitions. The thing I'm extremely interested is why Chinese scholars based in China so love term rumors instead of any other. There are so many interesting things to this when you like to build typology of that type of categories and fields. But again, like we need to somehow try to approximate, and that's perhaps the only way is just unify them into one, at least for a study or two. Thanks.
There was a question about academic institutions.
Which suggested?
Do you want to reframe your question on academic institutions?
What's the role of academic?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. Actually, I don't think we studied it. Do we study that question? I don't think so. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to note, I think it's really these academic institutions probably are really the bearers of the fact that they need to define and the research. And what I'm worried is that this not working according to the standards and criteria actually creates misinformation. So, thank you.
Hey, excellent presentations, really trying to think through what the implications are, and probably having some of my research in your data set about throwing out recommendations but not being able to evaluate them. Guilty as charged. And that's probably because there is an actual impossibility of working with platforms to truly evaluate what it is the outcomes of any of these interventions are. There's a lot of missing data, there's a lot of obfuscation, there's a lot of pushing and pulling to try to get data out. The half a data set shows up. And all the while, they're also trying to put their point of view and spin on this field, and it no more does it show in the confusion around misinformation, disinformation, influence operations, information operations, and then the favorite of Facebook, coordinated inauthentic behavior. And now I'm watching a perceptible shift from content moderation to trust and safety. And they're moving away from the words content moderation and towards this other lexicon. And we saw this happen in AI as well, because before it was AI, it was talking about algorithms, and once we started talking about the bias of algorithms, we got into other problems. So they tried to call it machine learning, but it didn't really catch on. And so now we're at AI. And so I'm wondering, for your research, kind of piggybacking on the last question, why did you change it, and what do we need to retain as scholars so that we can name very specifically that intentionality, that there is an intention with disinformation, and there is, this is a forensic field, and we can find that intention. So what do we lose if we start to become kind of wishy-washy about how, shoving everything into the category of misinformation?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I also think it's important to bear in mind that part of the reason I think why there's been so many name changes over the years is because this is not a group of activities that has been fixed over time. We've kind of been adding things that we've deemed unreasonable activities into this group. Maybe we've removed it, like the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior is shifting, and the kind of activity that we, and I think the platforms are concerned about, is also moving, and perhaps the lexicon is also shifting in response to that. So I kind of wish we did have a defined lexicon. I know when I joined this group, the term that was favoured was computational propaganda, but I think we can all agree that doesn't necessarily encompass all of the activities that we've been discussing here, and that we've been discussing at large today that we're concerned about. I think it's just a reflection of the kind of different activities that we're concerned about and where we decide to draw the line.
So I'm just mindful of time. There's a person in the back with their hand up, and then there's the two gentlemen next to Joan. So maybe we'll take all three questions and we'll have a closing reflection from each person.
Thanks. I was wondering, how do you draw the line between censorship and misinformation, particularly given that Twitter and other social media companies now open up offices in certain countries where they have to coordinate with those governments. I'm Turkish, so I'm thinking of the Turkish office, and in your graph, the 2015 jump corresponds to the appointment of a Turkish coordinator in the Istanbul Economic Office, I'm not sure. But so how do you know that these claims that, these disinformation claims are actually not actually censorship claims?
So my questions sort of follow on the last 3 or 4 questions. They're all somewhat similar, but I'd like to add an invitation onto the end of them. The general question is, what are we really learning I think everything that was presented was fabulously interesting as a first go. But what are we really learning when, in response to questions based on specific knowledge of different countries, the response always is a defensive one about the nature of the methodology? Well, a methodology doesn't tell us that, whatever. So a lot of social science falls back on that kind of defensiveness when in fact what we need is the information about what's actually going on in these different places. That said, let me invite you, since we have an expert on China here. Hannah, I was struck by the fact that your methodology and what you presented here, and I understand that's only a piece of what the Institute is doing, did not include China, did not include the WeChat and the enormous China sphere. And yet, on the other hand, when Aliaksandr presented, China was on the list as a source of information. So this probably can't be answered here because it would take longer time. But since I'm interested in Asia in particular, and Southeast Asia as well, I wonder what we can say about China. And in that regard, I wonder if there's a way of tagging the difference between official communication on the internet and unofficial citizen communication that is, in the Chinese case, not orchestrated by the government, because a lot of it is. But I note the fact, just to go back to the example of Turkey, I don't know if it's still the case, but for a long time Turkey had, in a sense, two internets. They had an internationally facing internet, and they had an internally facing internet. So if you did Google searches for something through an English medium, you would miss most of the domestically important information. The same problem for Iran and a number of other places.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question about more kind of empirical thing, in the sense that you have not mentioned Russia. So when you talked about that Georgia is responsible for misinformation, so one of the post-Soviet country, I can give you an example of National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute. When they make the polls in the country, they identify that one of the most important actors in terms of disinformation, not in terms of misinformation, is Russia. So then you just show up that the Georgia's government or country is responsible for misinformation. Even I don't understand first the terminology of misinformation, and the second, I don't know to what extent I have to see this data as a valid one when the Western-driven, scientifically driven, and confirmed institutions say absolutely opposite. And when we mention and when we talk about the misinformation in Ukraine, in Georgia, or in other post-Soviet countries, and we don't say that Russia is one of the actors, and I mean, whom should take the stance spreading disinformation. I mean, I would rather hear your reflections about that.
So maybe each of you can take one of the three questions, and that'll help us also segue to our wrap-up next section.
So I'm just trying to remember all of them. So there's one about Russia, one about China.
Perhaps I'll start with China, given that
Sure,
was kind of
sure.
explicitly directed towards me. Of course we used data from Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and of course these platforms are not available in China. So in order for Chinese people within China to access these platforms, they have to, quote unquote, jump the Great Firewall, to use VPNs and other means to access these platforms. So it's kind of understandable that we wouldn't see a large contingent of people from China who are either spreading or targeted by information campaigns, misinformation on these social media platforms. because these platforms are not available in China. That being said, you'd raise, WeChat, Weibo, these other platforms are available in China, and this is as a social data scientist who studies China, this is kind of a constant problem for me, is lack of data. It's so hard to access data from these platforms. These platforms do not have publicly available APIs, or even APIs available to researchers who apply to them. Obviously, you can try and scrape these platforms to understand what's happening on a large scale, but these platforms are designed to prohibit scraping. So yeah, data's the problem. Obviously though, I do pay attention to what's happening on kind of a more qualitative level, and like I said, I do produce like a weekly newsletter on stuff that's going on in China, information operation activity that's going on in China, if you're more interested in that. But yeah, it's more difficult to understand at scale. Perhaps I'll hand over to Turkey. Oh, okay. Given that was directed towards my slides, yes. So as you said, Turkey censorship. The censorship question is a censorship. Well, I mean, like you said, I couldn't really delve into the story of every single country that experienced a spike or was highlighted on the heat map for various different reasons. If you're interested in the specifics of particular campaigns, Facebook does produce a kind of Word document with examples of the kinds of activity that was prevalent in the campaign and the rationale for taking it down, if you're more interested in that. And also this is kind of linked up to the Georgia question. So yeah, if you're more interested in why Meta took down particular accounts and why they linked them to domestic activity, I would encourage you to have a look at their kind of individual country level reports. When they linked these reports to domestic activity, this isn't to say it was produced by the Georgian government. It's to say that, or the Turkish government. It's to say that these were produced by actors acting within Georgia, and particularly in Ukraine. I think if you look at a few of their reports, it's individuals acting who according to their kind of IP addresses and are acting from within these countries, but aren't necessarily acting on behalf of groups within these countries. There's some question as to whether Russian actors are actually operating from within Ukraine to spread these operations. So when you see that these are domestically attributed operations, there is a level of ambiguity around that. And I think kind of like wrapping this all up, that's why this is kind of a high level look at things, but I would say this is by no means the entire story, of what's happening at a global scale. Much more effort, much more research is needed on kind of individual level countries, exploring exactly why these campaigns happen, who, the motivations behind these campaigns, to kind of uncover these more local level stories. And with that, I'll hand over to Hubert and Alice.
I don't remember if any of the questions were specifically targeted my slides, so I can maybe talk about kind of general learnings that we're hoping to get, at least in mind. We thought a couple of things. Hopefully we can build this kind of holistic picture, but also to get a sense of what sorts of thinking in different countries about where to go next. So is it a particular ways in which to regulate or to increase media literacy? These are ideas that we want to collate and be able to present. Not in full today, but definitely coming, and that's something that we will be able to produce, and not kind of falling back on our caveat methodology, hopefully. But then also on the small point of Russia, I do have data on that in terms of the foreign government experience from the survey. I haven't included the graph, and maybe I should have. But it is consistent with what you were saying, as Russia is a major source of disinformation. So,
all right, I perhaps just conclude with saying thank you a lot for your questions, and thanks for coming and listening to us. I think this discussion reveals the great extent to which when we try to look into this question beyond Western context, perhaps, and to different, very diverse contexts, it becomes even more complex because of, indeed, a different perception of what we mean by a political lie. What is the source of lie and truth in different contexts? I think in Russia, the greatest source of misinformation is its own government, right? And it's very different context from what, for instance, many other countries live in. And this by itself already places us in very difficult situation how to summarize this type of research. But I think it's still worth moving on and forward. It's still worth hoping that platforms become more transparent in there, as John mentioned, the importance of making, getting as much data as possible. What we've been doing in our set of papers is that trying to get what we have, trying to summarize knowledge of experts, trying to summarize knowledge that being provided by platforms, and try to summarize previous literature. We're doing what we can, and with the hope that more data will be available in the future. Thank you.